this is a brand lift study, Bryan, that you conducted with Coleman Insights. And I'll just say quickly, I have known the folks at Coleman for over 30 years. I've known John Coleman for over 30 years. Same with Warren Kurtzman and Jay, who did this study with you. These are incredibly good researchers. But I want to give us a little background on what this was. And we're not going to be able to reveal the brand, but it's an imported an imported car brand that you've certainly heard of.
Yeah, we had been working with this brand and measuring the impact of their campaign over multiple quarters. So this campaign and this partnership continued over multiple months, allowing us to measure the impact and the lift of not only the campaign that ran in Q1 and early into Q2. However, we were able to match that back to the data and the effectiveness of the campaign earlier in the year, late last summer. So this is an ongoing partnership and a tremendous example of just kind of the different creative units that we leverage. That is certainly one tactic that we take here at Locked On is there's no one size fits all ad solution. And so we always work with our partners to kind of meet their needs and allow and help them curate the campaign to be most effective with our sports audience. And so it's just a great example here from Coleman of some of the impacts there and over a broad range of KPIs and goals.
Yeah, and I want to touch on some of those kind of in the order that we looked at them in aggregate in the previous data. We're going to see this with this very specific example. Let's start with recall, and because that's sort of at the top of the funnel here, where you're just asking people for just recall of all game. Which of the following vehicles have you heard advertised in the past 7 days? And I'm going to talk a little bit in general about this slide, but then Bryan, I'd love for you to talk about the actual individual treatments and executions here. But essentially, what you're looking at are the differences between a control group and an exposed group, and each of those groups was about 1,000 adults 18 plus. So the sample size here is very, very robust. And when you're looking at a sample size like that, any difference you see over three or up is absolutely significant. And you definitely see that overall adults 18 plus, you see a 6-point lift from the control to the exposed, see a 5-point lift with men. You also see a 5.3 lift with women. But where you really see the lift are with some of these different treatments. So, and starting with custom mid-roll, Bryan, you want to talk about that a little bit because that number's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay at Coleman likes to call this our secret weapon because we've seen this consistently. It's not just this study. When we work with our partners and curate a custom mid-roll, which is really a content-driven ad. So it's intended to create valuable and memorable content for the listener first, and then integrate the brand message second. And when we approach an ad that way, thinking about the listener experience first, we're able to embed the brand's message in such an authentic and organic way that it's super memorable. It's not skipped. It's something, in fact, that often audiences look forward to because it might be a reoccurring segment that becomes a staple in the show. And in this case, actually, with this client, this segment went on for 6-7 months. So that continuation, that consistency really allows the brand to, organically integrate them into the very fabric of the show. So there's no one size fits all here. Again, we don't have sponsored features available. The shot clock countdown or anything like that doesn't exist within Locked On. We wait for the brand brief. We look at that. We look at those brand goals. We look at brand messaging, what the goal is, and we curate the custom mid-roll from there. This in particular is really just a 60-second spot. However, upon your listening experience, it feels a lot more like content than it does an ad.
And by the way, I'm delighted to see this data because as lovely as Locked On is, I know that this story can be sung across a variety of podcast networks and a variety of podcasts. The thing that I'm really delighted again about is that we're getting this shared. This is the story that we need to tell. Before I leave this slide though, Bryan, you want to just quickly explain the other three types here: DAI, mid-roll, UMM, which I know what it is, but our audience might not, and then the
Sure.
DAI AV.
Yeah, I think it's important. I'll start actually with the title sponsorship because it's actually the only negative on the board. What's really unique about this placement is it is a show opener, right? So when the show starts and you hear this episode is brought to you by client X, it actually went beyond that. We used that unit in this campaign as a teaser for the custom midroll. So it actually said this episode is brought to you by this client. Stay tuned later in the episode for this segment. And so it was really driving awareness and engagement for the segment to come, really teasing that engagement rather than driving specific brand recall. So I wouldn't expect that unit itself to be driving high numbers in recall. However, it influenced directly the recall of the custom midroll. So folks really stuck around. They paid attention to it. They listened to it. They were already pre-sold to expect it through that title sponsorship. And that unit is where we really, really make a compelling, tell a compelling story to the audience. The dynamic pre mid roll, it's a dynamic 30-second pre-recorded pre-mid. We attack this unit in two different ways. We either take a client's pre-recorded spot or we have one of our hosts pre-record the spot ourselves. The WMM midroll was a women's March Madness custom segment as well. A really unique tactic. The client wanted to really associate themselves with women's basketball. I think a lot of brands are looking to support women's sports, looking for ways to associate themselves with that. And we were able to curate this segment as well to help the brand tap into that. And what you'll see later is really how well that resonated with audiences and how that actually influenced purchase intent higher than almost any other unit. So it really had the impact that the brand was hoping for. And last, I think, which is the most incredible, is the dynamic added value post roll. Too often, I think a lot of brands and agencies look at that unit as kind of a throwaway. However, when you look at it holistically across the entire ecosystem of the ad campaign, the title sponsorships, the custom mid rolls, the dynamic pre rolls, and the post roll, they all work collectively. Rising tides lift all boats, right? And so that really, you see that here in frequency and consistent messaging over time, all of these units working together to drive impact.
Yeah, and it always bugs me when people will say, "Well, post rolls don't work." Well, they may not work as well as something else, but that's how they work is not zero, and
Mhm.
and also that kind of thinking tends to view the podcast, the individual podcast consumed as like as if it exists in a vacuum, which is not how a lot of people consume podcasts. They go from one right into the other, which I certainly do, and did even before it was my full-time job. So there. So we spent quite a bit of time here on recall. So I'll go through some of these next a little bit quicker. And this is favorability. How would you describe your overall opinion of the following brands? And the real thing to point out here, I think, is the difference from running this campaign for as long as you did. And that, I think, is one of the things that we really have to talk about with our partners and the brands that we partner with. Is it's not so much patience, but it's building the thing. And building the thing takes time because you're asking people to change their mind about a thing that at the start of it, they may not have even cared about. And so when you show that kind of movement, and here we're seeing that kind of lift in favorability between Q3 2025 and where it was in the Q1 and 2 of 2026, it's an 8-point lift for the exposed over the control. That's pretty significant, but that's also a lift over time. So, Bryan, you want to speak to that a little bit about, and again, I think patience is not the word I want to use here. It's relationship.
Yeah. Building trust doesn't happen overnight. I think early on in podcast advertising days, and sometimes still to this day, we see the one or two spot tests to come in and measure effectiveness. But what I've seen here with Locked On over the last 6+ years and running multiple of these campaigns is frequency over time is king. Building that message frequency, building that historical with a consumer is incredibly important. And when you do that, when you stick with them, I think it goes beyond just ad recall, right? It's trust, it's credibility. And when you stick with that and you're with the audience and with the host and as a sponsor for a while, ultimately it has an impact. And you see that this is massive. The first campaign in Q3, I think we measured this over 6 weeks. And so it didn't have as much of an impact. A notable lift. We beat the benchmark, but when we stick with it for months and months and months and really stay with a consistent message, that the audience hears repeatedly, that's when we see noteworthy lift here to 60, to almost 63 of the locked on audience feeling now favorable to this brand versus just 50% of the prior year.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, and you just mentioned this, the fact that there is an automotive benchmark and that automotive benchmark is almost no lift, right? It's essentially no lift because we're talking about a handful of brands that are all generally heavy advertisers and that people have distinct opinions about. And, for some people, a good experience with a brand might stay with them forever and they don't even consider other brands. And for others, it might be, inherited from a family and some people just don't really care about it. So the category here is something to absolutely keep in mind that there's not typically a lot of lift when you're looking at this kind of advertising. And sometimes large national advertisers with large car brands are really looking at things in decimal points as they try to continue to move the needle or just continue to remain relevant. So the fact that we see this kind of lift in favorability against that benchmark, I think really speaks highly to the audience and it speaks highly to podcasting. And that favorability, I'll just show you again, echoing the first data slide here. Some of these differences here between the control audience and the exposed audience, again, led by the custom mid-roll treatment. These are exceptional. And again, statistically, as I mentioned, I would look at anything above 3 as like absolutely, statistically significant. And custom mid-roll, almost 19 points here of lift between the control and the exposed, 17 with the DAI pre-mid-roll. So these are not small numbers, Brian.
Yeah, we were really
Right.
pleased with these results. It's not, again, we've seen these results consistently, specifically with the custom mid-roll performing with for clients time and again. But yeah, these numbers are certainly impressive, and that's what we strive for, right? The goal at the end of the day is to make an impact for the brand, and with the right creative and the right strategy and the right full ecosystem that we build out, there's always a way to drive those numbers. But this is certainly these numbers were certainly pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I'll just go through some of these last. We're kind of working down the funnel here, and this is for brand consideration. And again, the story is that the custom mid roll does the best here. The DAI pre mid roll and the WMM mid roll also I think show really good statistically significant lift. But the kind of cool thing about this question to me, again, I would ask you to consider the category. And that category, people can be really set on. They may have a very small consideration set. We're not talking here about brands of candy in the candy aisle right before checkout. We're talking about a car, a significant purchase that people tend to do a lot of research about. And the fact that with the custom mid-roll, for example, but also with the WMM mid-roll here, that 6-point lift is really a double of what the control is, right? It's twice what the control is, which means that the audience here that was exposed to that custom mid-roll are twice as likely to consider this brand as people who weren't. And again, considering the category, I find that just as a career student of consumer behavior, a pretty remarkable bit of movement. Purchase intent is the next thing we'll look at. And again, which of the following brands are you intending to purchase in the next 2 years? And again, we see a very similar story. We see pretty significant lift with the custom mid-roll and the women's March Madness mid-roll. But we also see it with a little bit of a bump, 18 plus and with men. And these are the numbers that tend to be really, really small purchase intent because think about what you're asking here. But we're still seeing that lift. And again, nearly a 10-point lift with the women's March Madness mid-roll. And I think that has to do with a number of factors. I think the brand, yes, the advertising, yes, but that sort of unique marriage of content and potentially newly exposed audience, Brian. It's a very unique, I think, aspect to this campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was directly what the brand was trying to accomplish, right? They wanted to associate themselves with women's sports, and they felt that that would have a certain impact and resonate with audiences in a certain way. And it did. It deeply resonated with them. It was something that they remembered, and it's something that influenced their willingness to consider this brand as the vehicle that they would purchase next. And you're absolutely right. We're talking about cars. These are 30, 40,000 plus, vehicles. These are not small decisions of whether I'm going to purchase this or not. So to influence that decision in any meaningful way is very challenging. But to do so using this unit, either the custom or the March Madness, but particularly that March Madness, we were able to tie the brand directly to content association that they were looking for, and it had the immediate impact that they were hoping for, which is an emotional resonance with the consumer, and that resulted in purchase intent consideration. So I think one thing that's really interesting with all of it, and something that we covered with that year over year analysis, is that overall the brand marketing is working, right? If we looked at that year over year analysis,
Mm.
we saw a lift on the control as well, which is important, right? So everything that the brand is doing across all of their entire media mix is working overall. It's just that sports podcasts, as we talked about with the lead into all of this, the spinach, is that ultimately sports podcasts are driving higher trust. They are driving higher engagement. And they are driving higher consideration because of that. And so, really, the results from this campaign are just a direct impact of everything that we saw in the previous data slides.
And I'm going to end this section here before we get to some final thoughts and some questions. This is one of my favorite slides, and just again from having done a ton of brand lift studies myself when I was working for clients privately, this is the one that really to me shows you how well advertising is doing. Because the brand itself might already be well known. The brand itself, is a brand that almost anybody who drives cars has probably heard of. But what this particular slide shows is specific attributes that the brand wants to be associated with, right? And I don't know what these attributes are, but for example, they could be safety, they could be performance, they could be something more specific about a feature of the vehicle. It's a thing they want to be known for. And the brain does not open itself up to that layer of detail unless it's already been opened up to be receptive to the brand. And so even if you see some positive results for the brand, that doesn't necessarily mean that the door has been opened all the way for the brain to actually consider, okay, and here are some things about the brand that I recall. Oh, this is a car that has 5 wheels, or this is a car that cooks lunch in the glove compartment. Whatever those attributes are, people don't even open the brain up to them unless they're already through the vehicle, through the medium, receptive to that brand. And that, and for this case, it really doesn't matter what these attributes are. I think this slide is a measure of that deeper relationship, of that, next layer of the brain and the mind opening up and being more receptive. Any more context you want to add to that, Brian?
No, I think that's exactly right. Getting those specific attributes across, whether it's built for adventure or it's high performance vehicle. It's really hard to get those messages across. And we can't see this slide here. It's from the larger presentation, but we saw considerable lift year over year from last year to this year on these attributes as well. So again, get messaging those attributes and messaging them consistently over time will inevitably have the impact. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways, is sticking with it, frequency over time, consistency with your messaging, and letting the hosts build that trust and credibility and get the messaging across is just the most important part of this. Trusting the plan, and sticking with it ultimately will yield the results that we're all looking for. Right? The brand is looking for these results the same way that we as a publisher are hoping to deliver on them. So we're all really in this together, and seeing these results is a perfect example of when we're working harmoniously together and all striving towards the same goal.
Yeah, and I want to back up here too and talk about just again why I was really pleased to be able to share this. And it's not because I think this is unique to you or unique to even the sports audience in some degrees. Although we have seen that the sports audience can be more receptive, but I have seen these slides for campaigns in other media platforms. I've seen these slides for TV. I've seen these slides for magazines. And again, in a lot of cases, when you're looking at big national brands like this, when you do see lift, you're seeing much smaller numbers. And so when people ask, how do I know that podcast advertising is working? I love to be able to show stories like this, especially in comparison to, other media platforms